This lecture covers the Anglo-Saxon period of English history, from 449 to 1066 CE. It is part of the background of the epic Beowulf, which we will read in English, as well as our studies of Europe in world history. Now, before we can look at the Anglo-Saxons, we should consider England under the Celts, and their reign in England began in about 900 BCE. Now, the Celts were just a large group of Europeans who lived all across northern and western and even southeastern Europe. And Celtic is the language that they spoke, and they were divided into all these different tribes. You kind of think about Native Americans when the Europeans arrive. That's kind of the way the culture and politics of Europe was under the Celts. And so these Celtic speakers arrived in England in about 900 BCE. And there were primarily two different tribes, the Brythons, who inhabited what is now Britain, or the larger main isle of Great Britain, and the Gaels, who settled in present-day Ireland, the smaller western island. Now, both Celtic groups spoke languages from the Celtic family, which is far different from Germanic languages. English is actually considered a Germanic language, and you can see an example of written Celtic here. This is actually Gaelic, and this is the Lord's Prayer written in Gaelic. And as you can see, the characters or the letters are far different from English letters. I would be surprised if any of you can read any of this. And these Celts lived in closely tied clans and were farmers and hunters for the most part. This was an Iron Age culture, so very low technology. And the Celts were led by Druids, who were these priests. And the Druids were very important in our study of literature because they preserved the people's myths and legends by reciting long heroic poems. Right? The Celts didn't have a form of writing at this time, and so all literature and history and law had to be remembered by the Druids. And again, we're building up to the Anglo-Saxons. The next group to invade England was the Romans. And the Romans ruled for about 300 years. And their contributions to England were primarily in the form of roads and towns, which continue to be used and inhabited today. One interesting feature of the Romans you see in the picture below here was what we call Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian was a Roman emperor, and he built this wall all the way across northern England to protect the Romans from the Celtic tribes to the north, the ancestors of the modern-day Scots who live in Scotland. Now, this wall was nothing compared to the Great Wall of China, but still a very important defensive line for the Romans. And Roman rule ended in England because Italy was under attack from northern invaders. And these were also Germanic or Celtic tribes, the so-called Vandals and the Visigoths. And basically the troops were called home to defend the homeland, and that left England open for the Anglos and the Saxons, these two other Germanic Celtic tribes, to invade and take over. The Romans also brought Christianity to the island. But beyond that, their influence wasn't felt. It was primarily the Anglos and the Saxons who changed the British Isles. And the Anglos and Saxons, as I've mentioned, were these Germanic Celtic tribes, and they were able to take over the Brythons, the tribes who the Romans had conquered, by simply rowing up the English rivers. The picture you see here is of a boat that we think of as being a Viking ship, but the Anglos and the Saxons used these as well. And these were great river raiding ships, as we'll see in an upcoming slide. But these Anglos and Saxons were made up primarily of three groups: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And you can tell just by the name that we give to this period that the Jutes weren't very powerful. The name England actually comes from the word Angle, and English actually comes from the word Angle as well, right? English was once upon a time pronounced Anglish. And so as we look at a map of England under the Anglo-Saxons, we can see how these different tribes gave their names to these regions, right? The region to the south known as Wessex and its neighboring Sussex, right? These are the Saxon lands, right? The West Saxons and the Southern Saxons. And if we look at the green area in the middle, off to the right, we can see East Anglia, right? The land of the Eastern Angles. And so as we look at some of the place names in England, even today, we can see the influence of the Angles and the Saxons. So where did the British tribes go, right? The Brythons and the Gaels. Some went to the edges of the main island, regions like Cornwall and Wales. Others went to Ireland, the island to the west, and others went north into Scotland. And this movement helped to preserve some of the Celtic languages like Cornish, Welsh, Irish Gaelic, and Scottish Gaelic. And all of these languages are still spoken today, and more people are starting to, I guess, relearn them. And so the languages are kind of going through a little bit of a rebirth in England. The next major wave of invasions was the Danish invasions, or the so-called Vikings. As you can see from the map, these again were invaders from the European mainland, Denmark, southern Norway, southern Sweden. And these invasions took place between the 9th and the 12th centuries. As you're going to see, I mean, the history of England is really just a history of different waves of invasions. And the English king Alfred the Great was able to resist the first invasions, and so the Vikings didn't really take over England. They were more like hit-and-run raiders. They would sail these longboats up these great English rivers and attack small villages. In fact, the Vikings' favorite place to raid were monasteries, right? Monks and priests don't make very good warriors, but they're in these buildings that are full of all these beautiful artifacts, gold and jewels and things like that. And so the Vikings didn't have a long-term impact on Great Britain, but they did, have a lot of hit-and-run raids. And so let's return our attention to the Angles and the Saxons, right? And let's look at the hierarchy, right? Anglo-Saxon culture was very hierarchical. And what that means is that there was someone clearly at the top, some people in the middle, and then a lot of people at the bottom. Kind of think about a pyramid, right? And so at the top of that pyramid was the king. And he was expected to be generous to his loyal subjects, right? The king was a king because he was a powerful warrior, but then to stay king, he had to give his people lots of things, gold and property and horses and all kinds of things like that. And right underneath the king were the thanes. And the thanes were the king's warriors. They were often related to the king as well. They claimed kingship to their founder, and they were expected to be loyal. And so that was the primary relationship in Anglo-Saxon hierarchy, right? A generous king and loyal thanes with gold and other goodies as the main thing that held that relationship together. And the major setting in Anglo-Saxon society, and we're going to see this in Beowulf, was the mead hall. And these were large wooden structures where the king lived and kind of held his court and held parties too. This was the major social center of Anglo-Saxon culture. And so we can kind of imagine the mead hall as this place of drunkenness and storytelling and music. It's kind of one big party, as we're going to see in Beowulf. The Anglo-Saxon religion was more of a pagan religion, right? It wasn't a monotheistic religion like Christianity or Judaism. It was a pagan religion, meaning they had lots of different gods in different regions, different gods for different things like warfare or farming or the sky or the weather. The Anglo-Saxons also had a firm belief in fate, or what they called their weird. The Anglo-Saxons believed that everything was controlled by fate, that human choices didn't really matter very much, and what mattered was a person's fate. And these Anglo-Saxons worshipped ancient gods like Tui, the god of war, and the sky, Woden, the chief of the gods, and Freya, who is Woden's wife and goddess of the home. In fact, if we look at those names, they're still in our day names in English, right? Tui was Tuesday, right? Wednesday is Woden's day, and Friday is Freya's day. Now, Christianity had been introduced by the Romans, and the Celts had been converted, right? Particularly Irish monks helped establish a strong Christian hold on the Irish island, and then northern England was held by the Scots, and the Scots also retained their Christianity. So while the southern part of the main British Isle, England proper, was more of a pagan land under the Anglo-Saxons, it remains somewhat Christian, and like I said, Ireland and Scotland were much more Christian. And we're going to see this influence on Beowulf. In fact, the essay that I'm going to ask you to write on Beowulf, you're going to explore how Beowulf is both a Christian and a pagan text. And you're going to make a final interpretation about whether Beowulf is more of a Christian or more of a pagan text. In 597, the Roman cleric St. Augustine arrived in Great Britain, and St. Augustine was able to convert King Ethelbert of Kent, and this led to his whole kingdom being converted. This is a common pattern we see in European history, right? You convert the king, and then the rest of the tribe converts automatically. And Augustine was able to bring a lot of the Christianity back to the southern part of the main island and to convert these Anglo and Saxon tribes. And the church had a major influence and helped promote peace and unity among the English people, right? The idea was that, look, we're all Christians, so we shouldn't fight with one another. And the church also helped to bring education and written literature to the islands. In fact, again, as we look at the history of Beowulf, we're going to see that it was primarily an oral epic, but that it was written down by Christian monks, and this helps to explain the Christian influence on the formerly pagan epic. And monks also worked as scribes, recording and duplicating work by hand. In fact, pretty much all the written records that we have from this time period were produced by monks, writing down, what these pagan tribes had formerly just memorized. Another religious figure and historian that we have from this time period is the Venerable Bede, who is known as the father of English history. Again, this was a monk who wrote an important book called A History of the English Church and People, which is the clearest account of the early Anglo-Saxons that we have. Now, the Anglo-Saxon literature itself, as I said, was primarily an oral literature, and it was spread by the so-called shops. That's how we pronounce that word, S-C-O-P-S, the shops, who recited these long epic poems. And these poems were either heroic or literary. Beowulf is more of a heroic poem. And so these verses were very easy to memorize. And when we look at the literature itself, we're going to look at the different patterns in the literature that made it easier to memorize. Because again, these were a pre-literate people. They didn't yet have a form of reading or writing. That's what pre-literate means. So let's look at some of the characteristics of Anglo-Saxon poetry. First, every line had a so-called caesura. And the caesura, the root word is the word for cease or to stop, right? These caesuras gave rhythm to the lines of the poetry. Also, Anglo-Saxon poetry relies on alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds, right? So if I say baby blue bubbles or blue baby bubbles, or I say Sally sells seashells by the seashore, those are all examples of alliteration, that repeated consonant sound. Finally, the Anglo-Saxon poetry had a lot of kennings, and kennings are metaphorical phrases. These are where they had, so-called stock epithets, which were a work or phrase characterizing a person or a thing. Very often kennings showed relationships among people, right? So I might be called Brooke, Douglas's son, or I might be called Brooke of the rolled up sleeves. These different metaphors and characteristics that were used to describe people. We might call Michael Jordan, right, the high jumper, or the Lord of the Slam Dunk, right? Michael Jordan, Lord of the Slam Dunk. And these were all kennings, these very heroic ways of describing people. And so as you read Anglo-Saxon poetry, and really any narrative poetry, I want you to keep something in mind, and that is don't stop at the end of a line, stop at punctuation marks. Very often students get confused by narrative poetry because they want to stop at the end of every line. And certainly if there is a period or a comma or a question mark at the end of a line, you should pause or stop. But if there's nothing at the end of the line, you just keep reading on to the next line the same way you do when you read normal books. The end of the line has more to do with the beat in Anglo-Saxon and really any poetry, and it has nothing to do with the meaning of the line. So if you stop, you're going to destroy the meaning of that line and you're going to get confused. So again, don't stop at the end of a line. And so this wraps up our study of the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon period ends in the mid-1000s, right? By 1042, the Danes were out of power, and Edward the Confessor was on the throne. And Edward was a very religious man, and he studied in Normandy, which is in France. And so when Edward dies in 1066, that year the Normans overpower the Anglo-Saxons, and this is the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. And when you watch the history of the English language lecture, or you study the history of the English language lesson, the history of English lesson on the Moodle, you'll see how this connects. This right now maybe seems like it makes no sense in this lecture, but I'm making a connection here to the history of the English language and European history more generally. So just keep this in mind as you study other lessons and lectures. And so that's it. Thanks for watching.